I should warn you at the beginning of this video that this is very spoilery, and if you haven't read this book, I really think you shouldn't watch this video. You should just go in cold and have the experience. And with that, here's my discussion of it. Hi folks, welcome to the second episode of this track of Patreon Recent Reads. This time I'm actually doing a book that I really recently read, just a few days ago that I finished, UBIK by Philip K. Dick, which up until having read it, I always pronounced UBIK. I was gonna try to review this like on the day that I finished, the last words of the last page to get it really fresh. And I realized it's just one of those novels you need to process for a little bit before, discussing it. And, the short version is, wow. Wow, this was so good, so fascinating. It's kind of a game changer for me in a lot of ways. But it didn't feel that way when I was first starting to read it. I almost feel tricked by this book. It seemed like, well, really something I wasn't interested in for a good 50 pages or so, and didn't really grab me till about halfway through. But once you get to the end, it's like, wow. So briefly, my story with Philip K. Dick so far has been very minimal and sporadic. Everybody knows Blade Runner and that's from him. And I always loved that title, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I'd always heard that Blade Runner was based on a novel called that, which seemed so cool. And, in the back of my mind, I need to read that someday. But way back, say, 20 years ago or something, a friend loaned me The Galactic Pot Healer, of all things, which I never hear anybody, or almost never. Recently, I finally heard somebody mention it, but it never even gets mentioned. For a while, I remember a while back going, did I remember that right? Is that a Philip K. Dick book? Maybe that's by somebody else, because I never hear anybody mention it. And I looked up, no, that is his book. Anyway, it made a big impression on me, that book. Strangely, I have no idea why I never, or almost never, picked up a Philip K. Dick after that, and certainly not right after. But, I haven't, well, I looked up the plot synopsis just really vaguely, but I haven't sort of looked into the details because I want to go back to it and just come in fresh. But I'll never forget that sort of moment when, as I seem to recall, he meets an alien entity and it manifests through a phonograph and a couple other things almost assembling to project this presence of an alien. And it was one of the weirdest things I had ever read. I mean, at that time, basically this was the same time I was discovering Lafferty amongst new wave writers and stuff, and there was lots of cool stuff I really liked. Probably nothing else hit me as so unique and unexpected other than Lafferty, than that Philip K. Dick novel. And then looking at the synopsis, I when I saw that it was, the guy is being summoned to, with others, with a group of people to I think raise this cathedral out of the waters on another planet or on the moon or something. I was like, oh yeah. I remember that aspect of it and being this is awesome and weird. I was kind of baffled by it and also in awe of it at the same time. The only other thing I remember, or seem to remember, is that its protagonist was not unlike the main guy in this book, Joe Chip, in just being sort of downtrodden. And Dick is so good at writing those types of characters. But yeah, so that made a big impression on me, but I never really tried Dick, except that I did finally, and this is going way back as well, at least 10 years or maybe more, I did finally read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I had a good impression of that, but not nearly, it didn't live up to my experience of Galactic Pot Healer. I think that's where I first encountered some of Dick's real drawbacks, which are definitely evident in UBIK. And there come these moments where his prose is just too pedestrian, and even sort of the plot itself has moments that are too mundane, or not even mundane, but just, they're boring. There is a boring element to some of his writing. But that said, I was definitely impacted by Do Androids. The atmosphere of the whole sort of, using a phrase from here, the ubiquitous trash that was everywhere, and they had a name for it and I've totally forgotten. I'm gonna look it up. Okay, yeah, Kipple. And this is one of the things that Dick does really good, I'm realizing, is this whole thing where he has this, some quality of the environment, whether it's social or otherwise, that simultaneously feels really like futuristic or, alternate reality-ish, and really gets you into that other place, but at the same time calls back to this experience so well without diminishing either. And it just, that sense of like junk everywhere, the sort of entropic accretion of just junk around us is very now modern times, as well as like uniquely part of that universe that he created in that novel. Another thing I remember was the relationship to animals in the novel was much stronger than in the film Blade Runner, and it actually enhanced what they are doing with animals in the film. That the film doesn't really explain this like slight emphasis here and there on animals. It just looks arty or whatever, but once you read the book, you're like, oh, they're working with that whole thing. But in the book, this whole like wanting to have like artificial, this is all from vague memory, but wanting to have sort of artificial animals and wishing you could have real ones and things like that. That was all really cool and interesting. Some deep stuff going on there. So I loved that about the book. And the real wow moment for me in the book was the mercerism, which I'd forgotten that was what it was called or whatever. But there's a particular moment. I feel like it was just one moment, or no, maybe it was several. I don't know. But where people kind of join in this like virtual reality of this guy, I think walking through a desert or something, and they like participate in this group experience that way. And it was just cool and weird and a little bit numinous. And I feel like there was even just this one particular moment where there was like this jolt of the numinous as like a person like connected to that group reality. Anyway, that kind of stuff, I'm now realizing, having read UBIK, I'm like, okay, this is something that Philip K. Dick does. And he has these like, these jolts of numinous reality shift or reality bending, right? That is just awesome. And I'm realizing, you know what? This is one of my favorite things that happens in fictions. This is one of my favorite kinds of fiction. And I've been trying to think about it, and I'm still kind of piecing it together. Where have I encountered this before? Can I make a list of works that do this kind of thing, And I've been reminded of various things. Of course, I'm always thinking about Lafferty and relating things to Lafferty. And he, of course, is a massive reality bender. I guess maybe particularly this is the case in some of the mid to late 70s novels, like not to mention Camels, and the two novels collected in Apocalypses, particularly the second one, the three Armageddons of Enniscorthy Sweeney, which is a title right out of Philip K. Dick. I don't know if Lafferty even read any Dick. That said, the way Lafferty does it is mostly very different than Dick, which is cool. Like, they're doing it in just two really different ways. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that Lafferty, when you enter Lafferty's world, you kind of know pretty soon that you're in a world where these things can happen. And they're kind of happening all the time, and in very varying degrees. Whereas with Dick, I think the reason you get that jolt is because they're less expected. And I was trying to think of Lafferty stories or novels or moments, that have more of that jolt, and I'm sure that they're there a little bit, but I'm kind of having trouble remembering exactly when and where and how they happen. I do think maybe there's a few moments like that in Fourth Mansions, which in many ways is, now that I'm getting back into Dick and realizing some things, pretty Dickian, maybe even out of all of Lafferty's novels, this might be the most. Again, just so different in some ways. But I've been thinking for a while, based on impressions about what Dick is about and stuff, that there is maybe a parallel there with Lafferty, and that relating him to Dick might be a way to help people access Lafferty a little more. And now I'm thinking, yes, I think that's worth pursuing. I want to look into that more. But I was also remembering a couple other authors who, as it happens, when I thought about where have I seen this in fiction before, some of the main places I've seen it would be like Tim Powers. And I was recently listening, there's a podcast I haven't had opportunity to mention naturally yet, that I really love, is SF Ultra, hosted by a lovely, lovely Irish fellow named Sean. And it is wow, you got to listen to it. His take on all, he's basically, his whole idea is like, I don't like SF, so I'm reading it to see if I can convince myself that I like it. And he kind of continues to not like it, but then surprise himself that he does like all these works, maybe many of which are kind of fringe. Anyway, he read Anubis Gates by Powers and hated it, which is no surprise at all. And I remember really enjoying that novel as I read it, but it hasn't stuck for me, and it's not really anything I want to go back to. And that's not really the Powers I like, his whole earlier historical type fiction. It's his 20th century settings that I find awesome. Like Last Call is the first book in this series, and I remember like a novel, 3 Days to Never. All of those have these like really reality shifting moments here and there, like that, like really break the rules, the ontological rules, and you're like, oh, not unlike what I experienced reading UBIK. I think a difference with Powers is that he's a much better prose writer than Dick, I have to say, and in some ways has a stronger imagination or way to realize his imagination. But he just doesn't have the full-on vision that, Dick has. Dick is a visionary, and I can't really say that about Tim Powers. Another author that came to mind is Michael Bishop, and particularly in this book, Catacomb Years from 1979, there was a couple moments with a projected film, and weird reality-shifting moments happening where you're just like, oh, what? And it's interesting to note that both those authors have a connection to Dick. Tim Powers was sort of in a friend circle with Dick late in life, so there's a direct causal influence there. And Michael Bishop has a novel called The Secret Ascension, or Philip K. Dick is Dead, Alas, which I believe is like a homage to Dick. And I don't know if he was friends with him or anything, but it's interesting that, Dick is on the radar for these two authors that I, was like, where have I seen this before? So, there's some downstream there from Dick. Although, fascinatingly, I have to say, as I read this, UBIK, I was like, why isn't there more of this in science fiction? And I've, talked about this before with discussing Lafferty and stuff, that, for me, science fiction that doesn't have that sense of wonder and that wow factor is just missing the point to me. And I suppose that comes in a lot of different ways for different readers. But I was wondering, why don't we have some of this kind of stuff in science fiction? There's probably way more of it out there that I just haven't encountered. But, I feel like I don't see it enough. And it makes me wonder, has anyone picked up the torch from Dick in a meaningful way, and so on? And I'm sure you'll be like, please let me know what you think about that and who your contenders are for that. A few other places, I guess maybe I've encountered some of that reality bending type stuff, and those moments would be Gene Wolfe's Solar Cycle, the whole thing. There's different moments probably in each of the book, each of the, Book of the New Sun, Book of the Long Sun, Book of the Short Sun. I remember sort of a time slip sort of thing that happens in Book of the New Sun, which was pretty spectacular. Apu Punchow, I don't know if that's how you say it, but deep cut Wolf fans will know what I'm referencing there. But in Book of the Short Sun, the third of those in that series, the second book of the Book of the Short Sun, In Green's Jungles, had just like ontological shifts that just, oh man, they were so good. But again, in a way totally different than Lafferty, Wolfe kind of sets you up with a whole narrative world that you can still get those jolts, but it's not quite as maybe unexpected as it was for me in UBIK. Another one that came to mind was Greg Bear's Blood Music, which I will do a different video on at some point, that just starts to ontologically shift things and then just goes for it and goes for it and goes for it until it gets so weird. It is awesome. It's so cool. But even like there's a moment late in the novel when all this sort of shifting has been established and crazy things have gone on, and like a little small thing happened with like text on a piece of paper or something that was almost more wowing than anything that had happened before, the level of reality shifting that was happening at that point. So yeah, I love that kind of stuff. And I have to manage my expectations here, because now I'm going to be, I have a bad habit of this. Once I find something I like, about music or an author, instead of like going, I just want to explore more from this person and see what all they do, I go in looking for that specific thing that gave me that gave me my hit, you know. So I need to, you know, just let Dick be Dick and see what happens. But I am kind of hoping for more of that, and I feel like in my limited experience, I have experienced that with all 3 novels that I read from him. So I do think it's going to continue to happen on some level, but I just need to let it do what it does. But it made me feel like there's, you know, the things that happen in UBIK make you feel almost ontologically queasy. They're like metaphysically vertiginous. You know, there's like this dizzying, on the cliff edge, whoa, you know, feeling to them. It made me think of a moment in Past Master by Lafferty, where one of the characters, Paul, does a little time traveling moment, and Lafferty doesn't get into any mechanics of that or anything. But here's how it describes it. Paul stepped through the tuned antenna-like loop, and to Brooks it was though the man had disappeared into the crackling air. To Paul, it was going through an unholy gray confusion that is deeper than darkness, and he was sick, as are all who follow the time ravel. And it's just a tiny thing, and it doesn't like totally capture how reading UBIK feels, but there is that sense of like, oh, like, oh, unholy gray darkness, whatever, and like, I'm gonna be sick, you know. And that is a little bit like what some of the characters experience in this novel as well. I think another thing that's unique about the way Dick does the reality bending is that in addition to, he has like this vision, well, it's actually not in addition to, it's because he has this vision, there's just this complete sincerity to it. You know, I think maybe a lot of authors are speculating and having fun, which is awesome. And they, you know, they've probably learned some tricks about how to, you know, kind of achieve this effect and that kind of thing. And Dick feels as if he's like desperate to like say something and communicate something and something of what he's seen and felt. And as you get into his life story, you realize that's very much the case. And that sincerity adds a level of the numinous to it, a level of that spooky, eerie, frisson, shuddering, trembling, sort of like, whoa, factor to it. And you know, Lafferty also writes from a sincere place, and I'm a sucker for the sincere. I love irony and satire and all that, but and people can do both together, as Lafferty certainly does. But Lafferty certainly has that level of the sincere completely. It's just different. I'll just have to keep thinking about how they're similar and different. But yeah, Dick is unique, I think, in this. And as I say, as I was reading this, I was kind of like, ugh, like, this is not good. Because I'd heard before that Dick is not the best writer, and he's really not, in terms of like prose style and these sorts of things. And as he set up his future scenario, I was really, really bored and uninvolved. I was not personally impressed at all by the sort of psychic abilities and telepathy, and then the people with the talents to counter the psychic abilities, that sort of setup, or the half-life thing, that, you know, this guy visits his wife in Half-Life, which now we're a little more used to that idea with various TV shows, Black Mirror and other stuff. I'm sure it was much cooler when Dick wrote it, but even apart from being familiar with it at all, the idea didn't wow me, nor the way he presented it. It was all fine, but I wasn't especially involved. You know, and for like 4 chapters, he's just kind of setting up all this stuff, and it didn't even feel like massively like this big careful setup. It was just like telling a story. And I think if his prose was like really crisp and solid, I've been reading some J.G. Ballard, like if it had been that kind of prose or something, you know, that would have helped with that sort of mundanity, and I would have felt more involved and enjoyed the setup a little more. And he's not doing any big characterization or anything, not much. And it was a little confusing. It wasn't, you know, very tidy the way he was setting these things up. And again, not confusing in some kind of cool way. But what I found as the book went on is basically the weirder Dick gets with the plot and or the themes, the better his writing gets. Once he gets into his properly weird territory, the writing is cool. It's still, you know, it has his limitations. Like I said, I don't think he's a great prose writer, but he's just more in his element. He's getting it across better. He's even using some better wording and different things. So that's quite an interesting thing to note. I did think this Joe Chip character was a good character and quite relatable. Frankly, his shabby, impoverished, whatever sort of guy. And I feel as if it was probably a bit autobiographical for Dick. and this whole this whole recurring idea of like having to pay to open your own front door or to get into your refrigerator or make coffee or whatever. You have to like pay these different machines a little bit, and they're always like, pay me this much, you know. That was hilarious, and it just added to the relatability, and again had that quality of like really setting up that future scenario but calling back to what we are experiencing, because like, you know, really nothing is free in our society. Probably the main thing that kept me going through those early chapters was the little epigraphs that start each chapter of the whole novel that talk about UBIK and advertise it as these different products, these disparate products, so that you're like, what? First of all, they were hilarious. They were just a tone. That was good writing, actually. The tone of those was brilliant. It reminded me a lot of like stuff like RoboCop and the adverts on that, and that era of science fiction and stuff, that sort of, you know, satirical dystopian type stuff. Really good in that way. Yeah, and the fact that they were so disparate, these different products being called UBIK, added to the sense of like, okay, I need to know what's going on here. So I was like bored, but like each chapter heading, I was like, okay, eventually we're going to figure out what this is about, so it's worth going on reading. And I did, before it was revealed what that was, I did catch on, just because the things were so disparate. I was like, this has got to be short for ubiquitous, and which was a surprise to me. I was like, oh, I've been calling it UBIK this whole time. I'm like, oh, it's UBIK. That was fun. But basically at the beginning of chapter 5, and this is almost 50 pages in, we finally have like a Dickian moment. It's not that big a deal, but a character is dreaming, and that dream sequence, it's not a big sequence or anything, but just that whole bit there, I was like, ooh, what's going on here? I'm more interested. And it was a little more what I expected from Dick. I was like, okay, maybe we're on to something. And then later in that same chapter, the first big bang, out of nowhere reality shift happens. It's not super spectacular. It's not like really awesome. I think the really great stuff happens later. And it's like something you've kind of seen before, with like a time slip that causes a difference in the present that only a few people can tell that it's happened. For Lafferty fans, think of Thus We Frustrate Charlemagne. But it happened pretty suddenly, and it was disorienting in a good way, but also not entirely, because I still don't entirely know what happened there. There's a lot of things like that in this novel where when I reread it, and that's a great thing. That's a good sign right there. It's definitely a reread book. It was I almost started it right over, but I don't quite have time for that right now. But you definitely want to read those opening chapters again once you know. And yeah, I will like them better, I'm sure, although I still think they're flawed along the lines that I said. But like, as to some of the confusion and unclearness, I'm curious whether rereads will clarify some of that, and Dick has, you know, sort of layered things and made things complex in a way that rewards rereads and that holds together better than it seemed at first, or whether he's, you know, a little slapdash, a little sloppy, a little not totally clear himself what he's doing, which, you know, if that's the case, it's fine. All the flaws and stuff in this novel, and I suspect throughout Dick, are just completely forgivable. And that, if you've watched my Lafferty videos, you know that I love art that reaches so hard it can't quite get what it's after. It's a bit broken, imperfect, because what it gets right is so right and better than anything out there that's perfect, you know, that's smooth and really nails everything. So Dick is fine with me in his limitations, because he's unlimited, quote unquote, in what he gets right and what he's able to do. Now here's the thing though. So chapter 5 gets super interesting, and I felt like it just went right back to how it was for a good 3 chapters or something. Because they go to the moon, and that whole thing was set up so much, and then it was just revoked, and it's like not even hardly part of the plot. I mean, it's an important plot point, but I felt it didn't deserve all the build up to it. The moment that's cool there is when this person floats into the air and becomes a bomb, which was a cool moment, except the explosion that happens, and then the way only one character is killed by it and the others are just kind of wounded, was so not believable. It was like this bomb would have like killed most of them or maimed them horribly or something, which of course later you understand why that's the case. And again, I'm not sure, like, could he have written it a little better? I'm not sure. But it made it a little hard to read at the moment. It was like, I don't understand what's happening here and why it's like that. But then also their response for like several chapters of like rushing this character back, who's the head of their organization, who are countering the the psychic powers of others. And all this kind of detail over, like almost like funeral type details, you know, not exactly, but like what to do now that this guy's almost dead and going into half-life and who's going to take over and whatever. Like just got really mundane again and was just not that involving and didn't totally make sense. There was no lead up to it that made you believe that, especially Joe Chip was like really upset about this and like, what are we going to do? Like they didn't have like this, there was not built up a big relationship or anything like that. And again, this is another aspect that makes more sense once you know what's going on, but I still think it probably could have been better written. But then finally, maybe around chapter 8, I think he discovers the desiccated body of one of the other characters in a closet in a hotel room. And at that moment, it was like really a sense of like, what is happening? I think there might be something really weird happening here. And then like shortly after that, they start to get messages and things from this character who has died. The first one, the head of the organization, Runsiter. And then you find, and they're all like going, what's going on? Then you're all the way in. It's halfway through the novel, 100 pages in about. So I feel like it took way too long to get there. And again, that would have been fine if the prose was like really nice all the way up to then or something. But by that time, you're like, who cares? We're in. Here we go. And it's unput downable at that point. It's the kind of thing that you don't go to sleep that night, you finish it or whatever. And as I said, the writing itself gets better at that point. Now, I should have said at the beginning, this is spoilery. So if you haven't read it, stop. Please stop. Please just read it without knowing what's going on. I have to imagine it's way, way better that way. And it deserves to be read that way. But now I'm going to talk spoilery. So once you discover that they seem to be themselves in half-life, and it's so cool, the whole like, I'm not dead, it's all you guys that are dead. Which, again, we're a little bit used to those kinds of reversals and reveals, I think, from a lot of films and different things today, although I don't know if I've ever seen it quite like this. But once you kind of figure out that's what's going on, or probably what's going on, it's very clever and very cool, and you're like, oh, that was cool. What a cool twist or whatever. But it loses a little bit of its metaphysical jolt at that point, which I didn't mind. I still wanted to keep reading and whatever, but took the juice out just a tiny bit. But it takes them a long time to really, really, really lock in that that's what's happened, because they keep thinking it, and then maybe evidence goes against that. It's actually quite confusing in a few points, and they're still trying to work it out. So it kind of kept that up, and that was cool. And from the ending, the very ending, like the last page, you're kind of like, what was going on the whole time? Were they in that? So, and that brought back that metaphysical jolt. So, yeah, very cool. And one of the things that was really weird and interesting is when he goes into this almost inexplicable 1939 setting. Like, why not go through several different periods? I mean, he sort of did with The Product or whatever, but one main, and he gives a reason for it, which is cool, because it's Runsiter's time, I think. But that setting is really well realized, and one of the best parts of the novel, just as like, okay, this is really well done fiction, and you can tell that Dick is super interested in that period, and then you remember, the Man in the High Castle is World War II era and stuff. He clearly has a super interest in this, so he can write about it really well. I'm sure he had read a ton about it and thought about it, and it's really well realized. It makes me wonder, obviously Man in the High Castle, but if there's anything else he did that has sort of more historical settings or moments of historical settings that he really cared about that might be well realized as well. But in that setting too, there's some more of that sort of reality shifting and stuff that's really cool. Now, there's something that occurred to me about it after finishing the novel. And I'm going to read you this passage. I'm not going to tell you what I was thinking. Partly, I wanted to read this passage before I had this thought, just because it's a cool passage and it is emblematic, I think. It's representative of the whole feel of the second half of the novel and the reality bending and so on. And especially earlier on in that second half, when you're still trying to acclimate and the characters are trying to acclimate and solve the puzzles. Like, what is happening? And in this moment, you still don't know what's happening. You're like, whoa. And this is just where I was just so enjoying this novel. I was like, this is what I crave. This is what I like. Ontology fiction, man, that just is spooky and weird. So here's the passage, and it's kind of a longish one, but it's good to hear this whole chunk. It's one of the other characters, Al Hammond, and he's with Joe Chip. And he starts to experience this. Now he became aware of an insidious, seeping cooling off, which at some earlier and unremembered time had begun to explore him, investigating him as well as the world around him. It reminded him of their final minutes on Luna. The chill debased the surfaces of objects. It warped, expanded, showed itself as bulb-like swellings that sighed audibly and popped. Into the manifold open wounds the cold drifted, all the way down into the heart of things, the core which made them live. What he saw now seemed to be a desert of ice from which stark boulders jutted. A wind spewed across the plain which reality had become. The wind congealed into deeper ice and the boulders disappeared for the most part. And darkness presented itself off at the edges of his vision. He caught only a meager glimpse of it. But, he thought, this is a projection on my part. It isn't the universe which is being entombed by layers of wind, cold, darkness, and ice. All this is going on within me, and yet I seem to see it outside. Strange, he thought. Is the whole world inside me? Engulfed in my body? When did that happen? It must be a manifestation of dying, he said to himself. The uncertainty which I feel, the slowing down into entropy, that's the process. And the ice which I see is the result of the success of the process. When I blink out, he thought, the whole universe will disappear. But what about the various lights which I should see? The entrances to new wombs? Where in particular is the red smoky light of fornicating couples, and the dull dark light signifying animal greed? All I can make out, he thought, is encroaching darkness and utter loss of heat. A plane which is cooling off, abandoned by its sun. This can't be normal death, he said to himself. This is unnatural. The regular momentum of dissolution has been replaced by another factor imposed upon it, a pressure arbitrary and forced. Maybe I can understand it, he thought, if I can just lie down and rest, if I can get enough energy to think. What's the matter? Joe asked as together they ascended in the elevator. Nothing, Al said curtly. They may make it, he thought, but I'm not going to. Yeah. Man, yes to that. And like I said, the writing is at its best when he's like most deeply into this strangeness. And it's much better when read in context because it just like slides you into this and you're still not sure what's going on. So I like it just for the prose and the imagery and the feel. But something I was thinking about afterward, because this isn't the only time this happens to various characters and Joe Chip, but this heaviness and weightiness and tiredness that comes over them as basically they're running out of half-life that they're in, but they're experiencing it as a full-bodied, full-world experience. And it's really hard to walk and to move and to talk and to think. And I just thought, and there's a lot of indications in the novel that kind of speak to this throughout from beginning to end. But I thought, this is like an allegory of depression and ill mental health. And it's really effective in that way. It's very poignant. It's very moving and powerful. And when I went back to this passage, not for that reason, just because I was like, okay, I'm going to read this passage out. And I looked at it, I was like, oh man, that really is like, that bears out my thought here about depression and stuff. Just that whole image there and the way this cold and what have you affects objects around you and makes them warped and stuff, and then is just like the whole world, but you're like, but that's not really what the world's like. This is in me, right? Or it's just everything inside of me, that sort of entropy within and without, and this sense of like, can I face death, real death, spiritual death? And like, just maybe I can understand this if I could just have enough energy to think. And that, that sense of like, I think the others are going to make it, but I don't think I'm going to make it. Oh, man, whew. You just want to give Phil a hug. And the scene ends kind of even worse on this level where the guy experiencing that just tells Joe Chip, like, man, he's in a bathroom and he's just like, and the lights have gone out or something. He's just like, leave me here, man. You got to leave me. And Joe doesn't want to, but he realizes he has to and leaves. And it's like, just the darkness of the bathroom and the door shuts. It's like, oh! So yeah, that's just one of many, many passages I could read and just show the reality, weirdness, and coolness of the whole thing. As I've used the word cool several times, this does remind me of something I've always said about Lafferty. When I try to describe how weird he is and stuff, and maybe summarize things and whatever, I think people will get, and you see some of his covers are pretty awesome, and people will get the idea that like, this is cool weird, but you can't expect that from Lafferty. He's going to be weird in a way that just doesn't really fit with anything, and in a lot of ways is uncool. It's, I do think Philip K. Dick is like cool weird, as are, other new wave SF luminaries and other sorts of authors, even like the Thomas Pynchons or whoever. All that stuff is like kind of cool, hip, weird, whereas Lafferty's way more of an outsider. And I think people who like cool, weird stuff, I do, will like the uncool weird of Lafferty, but you kind of have to let it do its own thing. Anyway, just two other things about UBIK then are that, let me read these UBIK epigraphs that go throughout. The last one just is so cool, and yeah, it just adds to that whole like game-changing quality of the novel, and makes you want to reread it and rethink it. And I think lots of people comment on this, but I'm going to as well. I am UBIK. Before the universe was, I am. I made the suns. I made the worlds. I created the lives and the places they inhabit. I move them here. I put them there. They go as I say. They do as I tell them. I am the word, and my name is never spoken, the name which no one knows. I am called UBIK, but that is not my name. I am. I shall always be. Man, so cool. So cool. And tying that kind of metacosmic source or whatever to these like capitalistic advertisements and stuff really adds to the twistiness of this whole thing metaphysically and ideologically, and like, what? In a good way, and Dick is definitely interested in theology, which I already knew, and it comes up here and there even in things I read. And I picked up on that early in the novel. He says that, like a character's like, I don't want to have a theological discussion, but this whole half-life thing has made theologians of us all, or something along those lines. And and this is something that only occurred to me after reading the novel as well, I do think there's like an incarnational theme in here of something from an outer reality becoming flesh in a quote-unquote lesser reality, that kind of thing, and help reaching you from the outside. And in fact, that's the other thing I wanted to say about this ending. Even before I got to the last page, as they were discussing this whole idea that these people both within and without the half-life are kind of helping them, because there's the other force, Jory, that's kind of eating them up, which I don't understand that totally. I thought that was going to end up being like a full-on alien entity or something, but I don't think it's ever really explained. I don't know if it is just this creepy kid or something, but that's a cool element as well. But these opposing forces trying to eat you or help you. But there's this part at the end of the penultimate chapter where Joe Chip is reflecting, and he says, "We are served by organic ghosts," he thought, "who, speaking and writing, pass through this, our new environment, watching wise physical ghosts from the full life world, elements of which have become for us invading but agreeable splinters of a substance that pulsates like a former heart." And when I read that, I was like, I feel like there's a bit of like allegory or metaphor going on here, that like the life we call the full life could be considered a half-life, from which a fuller life, forces from a fuller life could reach us. And knowing that little bit about how Dick felt he had some kind of revelation like that, I thought, yeah, well, first I just had that thought. I was like, ooh, it feels like there's a little bit of that kind of thing going on here. And then I remembered that Dick had that revelation and stuff. So yeah, I just think that's really interesting. And, it doesn't really matter what your personal worldview is or anything. It's just fascinating to see Dick bring these things up and get us thinking about them and discussing them. And so with that ambiguous ending, where Runciter, who is on the outside in the full world, it gets a 50-cent piece and it has Joe, because earlier in the novel, they had seen Runciter's head on money and different things, and it gets a 50-cent piece and it has Joe Chip's head on it. And he's like, wait, what? So good. And the last line is, "This was just the beginning." And it's like, I think you can have some quote unquote naturalistic interpretations of that, it struck me that it could just be that, like, without telling us, we're realizing here that Runciter has died and he's now in half-life, but he doesn't remember dying and, you know, being put in half-life, and so he's now in there with them and he's about to experience what they experienced. That's simple enough. But it feels far more ambiguous than that, and I haven't got into seeing what people say about it, you know, online and what have you. And I suspect there's differing interpretations there, but it does, man, I don't know, because it suggests that idea of the fuller life beyond the full life. But why would it be Joe Chip's head? So it could just be like this mutual influence or something. I don't know. You can tell I haven't really thought about this clearly at all, but it's cool. So highly recommended. This was great, and it's just fun, man. It's exciting when you finally come on something a little new, properly new for you, that just opens up new things for you, because basically at this point I think I have finally become a dickhead. Like, I get it. I'm like, yes, I need to read maybe not all of Philip K. Dick, but a lot. And I've always been interested in these titles, Flow, My Tears, The Policeman Said, or whatever it is, and these different things. I'm like, oh, now I have a reason to get into this stuff and like go for it. And I'd always been planning on reading UBIK and Valis, and I didn't think I was necessarily going to read much more, because I wanted to read Valis on that just for the metaphysical ideas or whatever. But now I'm like, no, I need to go back and read some other stuff, and then I'll get into Valis, and I'll probably try to do that whole trilogy that it's the first part of. But it's exciting, yeah, and to finally have like another author that I can obsess about for a while. And I really believe it's going to be rewarding. So yeah, let me know what you think of UBIK. You know, did you like it? What are your interpretations of it? What other Philip K. Dick do you like? Or what do you not like him? Do you not like UBIK or whatever? Yeah, thanks for checking it out. Thanks for your support.